Now the files are really large, and if you don't have broadband internet, like I say, you can download them and burn them onto a flash drive or a CD. You know, I mean, you can download them here and then play them at home. But it's one way to review. So, well, we want to do corporate responsibility, but before we do that, you all are business folks, so you may know a little bit more than even I do about collateralized debt obligations. I mean, there's a little case study, 4.5, that relates to what we were doing last time, and it talks about the ethics of a specific type of CDO, or collateralized debt obligation. And on 181, now, does anybody have any experience with these? I mean, these are very esoteric products. You know, even if you're in business, you don't necessarily have experience with CDOs. Well, the title, as you can see, of Case 4.5 is Casino Gambling on Wall Street. So that gives you a little idea of the type of risky instrument you're dealing with. And the problem, and this little case study concerns a specific CDO that Goldman Sachs put out during the financial meltdown. And one of the moral problems with these is they increase the instability, because especially the type of one that they're talking about is a collateralized debt obligation that basically is highly speculative in nature and does not contain actual bonds or mortgages. If you look at 181, they tell you a normal CDO. Again, when I was in the mortgage business, we knew that private debt was being bundled up, that loans, literal loans, were being sold to companies who would then bundle them up and securitize them. And this is one type of CDO, and now those were bad enough. No, it says a CDO is a collection of individual debts, such as home mortgages, that are bundled together in one investment pool. The pool can then be divided into different sections representing various degrees of risks and sold to investors. So people would buy securities on, say, a pool of mortgages, and you were hoping to get a return on your investment over time. And depending on the types of loans that were pooled together, some pools were riskier than others. But at least regular CDOs apparently contained actual mortgages or other instruments. And they note that it didn't have to be mortgages. It could you could develop a CDO by packaging various other types of loans from a variety of lenders. And what what your authors say is, although abused during the housing bubble, CDOs do perform a useful economic function. They allow lenders to focus on loan origination and investors to buy interest-earning securities. Right? In other words, lenders can focus on originating loans, on signing mortgage borrowers up, for instance, for mortgage loans, without part of their operation going to actually servicing those loans. But that's not the kind of CDO that that generates this title, Casino Gambling on Wall Street. Your authors go on to say what serves no obvious economic function, however, are so-called synthetic CDOs. These are complex instruments that are not actual packages of real loans. But what they instead represent is a bet on the performance of a package of loans owned by others. So, in other words, instead of being a CDO, which itself is a package of loans, what you're doing is you're buying an investment vehicle that essentially allows you to make a bet on how loans will perform in a package of loans owned by somebody else. So, in other words, there does not seem to be a direct function other than as a sort of speculative instrument to these synthetic CDOs. And famously, Goldman Sachs, who we saw last time, was one of the companies that was in trouble during the financial meltdown, did something that really raises ethical red flags. They say Goldman Sachs brokered a synthetic CDO, collateralized debt obligation, known as Abacus 2007 AC1. Now, what kind of instrument was it? Well, note they say it was based on the performance of a group of subprime loans. In other words, it was, what you were doing is you were betting on a package, a bundle of subprime loans owned by someone else. But unlike a normal CDO, a synthetic CDO like Abacus contains no actual bonds or mortgage loans. It merely references assets owned by other people. And like other CDOs, basically, you need to get investors to invest both ways in one of these. You need for somebody to bet that it's going to go down, and you need that to be balanced out by someone else who's willing to take the opposite position on these and bet that they're going to go up. But note what they say about these synthetic CDOs. So, in other words, you're making a bet on a separate bundle of loans. And Goldman Sachs was betting that this package of subprime loans was going to go down in value. In other words, and the problem was it picked risky loans and a package that it thought was going to do exactly that. Now, that's not what raises the ethical problem. What seems to raise the ethical problem is they had to get somebody else to take the opposite position. And they say these made a lot of companies a lot of money. 2 years before the meltdown, over $100 billion in synthetic CDOs were issued. But since these are nothing more than a bet on somebody else's package of loans, and they can be highly risky. One ethical problem is that they introduce increased instability into the system, and they say they were an important factor in that crisis. But now look what Goldman Sachs did. Now they said Goldman Sachs made $20 billion a year putting these synthetic CDOs together. And they argue for them, saying they believe that synthetic CDOs have a very useful purpose in facilitating the management of risk. But now, look what happened with Abacus 2007. What they say is, even if you're inclined to defend these risky instruments, it's a little hard to defend the actions of Goldman Sachs. And here's what they did that makes this a case study in business ethics. Goldman Sachs put together this Abacus 2007 AC1 package for hedge fund tycoon John Paulson. In other words, they constructed the instrument for a particular investor. But what was Paulson going to do? Well, you read on. They constructed this based on a group of lousy mortgage loans. In other words, really risky subprime mortgages. And what was Paulson doing? Well, they say they selected these for Paulson for the sole purpose of allowing him to bet that their value would go down. But now, as with any synthetic CDO, Goldman Sachs needed to find investors who would take the opposite position, which it did. Two largest being companies that are a little obscure, ABN AMRO and IKB Deutsch. But basically, Goldman Sachs gets $15 million for getting somebody to take the opposite position. But now, here's what the companies were not told, and this is what raises a real ethical problem here. The companies who took the opposite position, number one, were not told that Paulson was betting against them. Nor that he had selected the underlying subprime mortgages only because he believed they were sure to lose value. And sure enough, this amounted in losses of $840 million for the people who bet the other way, and Paulson made $1 billion off of them. But do you see what they did? They did not let the other investors know that this was an instrument of, it was a collateralized debt obligation on a bundle of mortgages that were specifically selected because they thought they were going to go down. And they wanted to allow Paulson to bet that they were going to go down. So, in other words, they're specifically selected by people who know what they're doing because they are highly risky and really lousy mortgage loans, right? And so, it's obviously not a funny thing for the people who lost $840 million on this. So, was Goldman Sachs wrong to sell these other investors the other side of this position without letting them know just how risky, a situation they were getting into. And note it says Goldman Sachs defenders say that the two companies, ABN and IKB, were themselves sophisticated investors who should have known what they were doing. Does that get Goldman Sachs off the hook? What do you think? Or is this a clear case where Goldman Sachs, is willing to take its $15 million in commission, let Paulson make, $1 billion, but allow this other company to lose $840 million because it doesn't tell them just how bad a bet they're making? And we don't know exactly how this package was sold. But we can bet that Goldman Sachs didn't let them know just how bad an investment this was. So, one, the existence of these synthetic CDOs is morally problematic, because it's a highly risky type of investment that isn't much different from, as they say, betting on a sports game,
Aren't they all basically betting the fact that these people aren't going to pay their mortgages and the homes on their homes?
Yeah, well, they are betting that, but apparently these are like a second level of risk. I mean, if you're investors in, and I don't know all the subtleties of these CDOs, but apparently they're trying to say that even though, they all are risky, right? If I mean, a lot of companies lost their shirts by betting on regular CDOs, right? On regular bundled subprime mortgages that they thought were going to, even though it was a risky bundle of loans, they thought enough of them in there would be performing that that it was good investment for them. Yeah. Well, at any rate, they're trying to say that the level of risk for some of these others is even greater. I guess some of the problems of these are that they are such ethereal instruments. That really it does take someone who is really savvy to understand all the subtleties of them. So whether or not Goldman Sachs gets off the hook or not, I mean, it's hard for me to think so. I mean, when they're selling this, knowing that they specifically picked these loans to go down, and now their salespeople have got to be pushing the opposite position to a company as if this is a reasonable risk for them to take, knowing full well that you specifically picked and constructed this CDO so that it would be a lousy risk for them, to take the opposite position on it, because you were very sure when you selected these loans that a lot of them were going to go belly up. So it's controversial. One of the things you'll see is something we'll play next time. I ran out of the house to my 8 o'clock class without taking my briefcase I used for this, and I have some specific business ethics related DVDs in that, one of which is a discussion of the narrow versus the broad view of corporate moral responsibility that I taped years ago from PBS, but that has actually withstood the test of time, I think. It's a discussion between a man named Feuerstein, who, now it's been so long ago that we don't remember, but basically he owned a company named Malden Mills that made Polartec outer gear. And at the time, it was a New England company that made a very high quality product. And what happened within 2 or 3 weeks of Christmas time is the factory burned down. And this man made the national news by basically paying his employees and keeping them on for months, even though there was no factory yet, while they, refurbished the factory. And so he kind of represents the broad view, and the other person in the discussion is a CEO who was famous for basically downsizing companies, firing people. Chainsaw Al Dunlap. He did this with Scott Paper and later Singer's sewing machines. And he turned some of these companies around, but he was not afraid to fire a lot of people and do a lot of other things. And he kind of represents the narrow view of corporate moral responsibility. Now, I said, in my opinion, I'm going to get you all a printout of this. Sorry I didn't do it this week, but I think this is like the center of the whole book. Everything leads up to this, and that comes before it, and everything kind of the later chapters basically concern areas where, if we were going to adopt a broader view of corporate moral responsibility, the various chapters concern relating to employees, to suppliers and other people other stakeholders you're going to do business with. There's a chapter on environmental ethics relating to the environment. In other words, the later chapters have to do with what businesses should take as a broader view of their corporate moral responsibility should they adopt a broader view. And so we looked at the first 24 slides of this because in it I got out the key features of capitalism. But I want to look at least the narrow view today. We're not going to, like I say, we're going to do an abbreviated lecture here. But the narrow view is similar to the narrow view in terms of a corporation's moral responsibility is very similar to ethical egoism in terms of an individual's moral responsibility. Because whereas ethical egoism holds that the chief responsibility of an individual is to look out for his or her own self-interest, the narrow view says that the main moral responsibility of a corporation or even of a smaller business is to look out for the interests of the owners. Basically, to look out for itself and for its own survival as a profit-making company. And so, you know, remember, I mean, Ayn Rand sells capitalism sells ethical egoism under the rubric of evolutionary theory, that being an egoist is the best way to ensure your individual survival. And basically, the narrow view of corporate moral responsibility says, well look, the chief moral responsibility of any business is to ensure its own survival. That is, to do those things that maximize the amounts of profit the company is going to make for the owners of the company. So the chief moral responsibility of a business, then, its only social responsibility is to maximize its own profits. Now, this view fits in very well with what we saw last time, was Adam Smith's defense of capitalism based on an unfettered free market that, if not interfered with, is going to, produce the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of productivity as a free market system. And of course, we saw last time the clash between somebody like Hank Paulson, who's a free marketer, and other people who wanted companies bailed out lest they fail and there be such a systemic risk that the whole system collapses. So maximization of profits then holds the narrow view is the chief moral responsibility of business. Now, Milton Friedman is the chief advocate of this view. And I follow the treatment in your text, or at least in an earlier version of your text. But this part has not changed very much in subsequent editions. So it says that the number one social responsibility of a business is to do what it's in existence to do, to maximize profit for who? Well, for the stockholder owners of a corporation. In other words, these are the only people that we're really concerned about having a moral obligation to. Now, I mean, Friedman is not, decidedly not saying that business should act in fraudulent or grossly illegal or unethical ways. So he does say that, there's a certain amount of background general morality that, business should pursue. Obey the rules of the game in the free marketplace, and not engage in predatory competition, compete fairly in a free marketplace, and don't commit deception or fraud. In other words, Friedman is arguing that a company has, a certain basic amount of moral responsibility to conduct itself in a fair and equitable and non-deceptive manner. But besides that, he says business, and this is a Harvard professor who agrees with Friedman, that business has only really two moral responsibilities then. To do what we saw in the previous slide, to obey elementary canons of face-to-face civility, honesty, good faith, and so on. You know, I mean, to deal in a forthright way with people, not in a fraudulent way, and to pursue material gain. In other words, this is the reason that businesses exist in a free marketplace, to basically pursue profit. You know, the profit motive as their motivator. And so this is what Friedman and Theodore Levitt, a Harvard professor who agrees with him, maintains. So what Friedman means, again, by the rules of the game, is to promote the kind of fair competition that Adam Smith thought would keep things working well in you know, a free, unfettered, laissez-faire capitalist economic system. Again, laissez-faire is basically to leave somebody alone, to let them thrive and prosper. Don't get in there and mix things up. Because the thought is, if somebody externally gets in there and messes things up, then they are inhibiting the productivity of the system by restraining the free hand that works to bring about the greatest good for all. Remember, that's Adam Smith's basic argument, that if people and businesses are left to pursue their own self-interest by seeking material gain and profit in the marketplace, that results in the most productive economic system, because in order to have something to trade in the marketplace, you know, companies produce new goods, you know, develop new products, render services, which promotes the general good of society more so than if companies were out first and foremost to give, not to pursue profit. And so the argument then is that if you get business away from its chief function in the marketplace, which is to pursue profit, and in doing so, you know, provide goods and services, then you're going to hinder the working of the invisible hand. What is management's role under the narrow view of corporate moral responsibility? Well, this view sees a really clear function of management. Management is employed basically to serve the interests of the owners. In other words, that is the corporate moral responsibility of management, to maximize profit for the owners, which in a publicly traded corporation are the stockholders, right? So executives then are employed by the owners to maximize profit for them, and are thus obligated first and foremost morally to serve the interests of the owners, not morally obligated first and foremost to you know, pursue other types of activity in the environment, in their corporate environment. So the argument then is, if you try to say that businesses should broaden their view of corporate moral responsibility, then you are going to lay on businesses obligations, moral obligations, that hinder their ability to do what they were meant to do. You know, to make profit by providing unique goods and services in a competitive free market. And so if you morally require businesses under the broader view of corporate moral responsibility to look out for other things than just the business's bottom line, and to do other things than maximize shareholder profits, then you're essentially subordinating the interests of the owners, the shareholders, to some other social objective, whether it's controlling pollution, if you're spending, you know, a lot of money on new scrubbers or equipment that's going to filter the wastewater coming out of your plant because you want to improve or not pollute the environment, then the money you're spending on that stuff is money that, under the narrow view, should be going to the owners of the corporation, to the stockholders, but instead it's going out there into the environment doing something else. So if you ask business to do things like control pollution or take their employees, like provide a higher wage for their employees, well, to provide that wage, whether it and whatever you call the living wage. Some people a few years ago were saying it's at least $10 an hour, and then I think $6.25 was minimum wage when people were saying this. Well, you can see there's a discrepancy between what a company is legally allowed to pay its employees and what some people might say are a living wage. But again, if you're paying employees more as stakeholders, then the argument goes that's money you're taking away from owners, from shareholders, and even things like preventing discrimination. So the idea is that getting businesses involved in doing these other things is somehow hindering the work of the invisible hand, and it requires management to spend stockholder money for general social interests. And so what Milton Friedman says is, if businesses adopt this narrower view of corporate moral responsibility, what we're doing is we're asking private businesses to perform the functions of government. Essentially, we are taxing the owners of the corporation, the stockholders, but again, taxation is a function of government, not of private enterprise. In other words, so this reasoning goes. Because, see, if a business adopts a broader view of corporate moral responsibility, the thought is consistent with that broader view, businesses will get involved in some of these other areas without being forced to do so by government. You know, but again, the narrow view says, look, I mean, if government forces businesses to do this, that's one thing, but that's different from businesses voluntarily deciding to take money that would otherwise go for stockholder profits and do other social interests. So he says if you were going to sum things up, the net effect of the broader view of corporate moral responsibility is that it would transform managers into something like governmental civil servants, turn corporations into quasi-government agencies, and diverts business from its proper social function, which is to be out there in the free market, producing and innovating in the area of producing goods and services under a profit motive. And so it undermines capitalism by viewing the profit motive, the motive that says that businesses are first and foremost in business to make profit for their owners. It views this as something that is morally wrong and wicked if that's the only thing businesses are doing. So now, we always said this narrow view basically views the management of a corporation as people who have been put in place specifically to serve owner interest. So the argument is that there is a kind of, whether or not it's down in black and white, that there's at least an understood promissory relationship between management and stockholders and owners, where management's role is, under the narrow view, to act in ways that will maximize shareholder owner profits. So it views, in effect, there being a promissory relationship between management and owners. And this, again, is consistent with profit maximization as management's sole moral responsibility. In other words, it views managers as having effectively promised to run the corporation and to make decisions solely to promote the interests of the owners and maximize their profits. And the idea is that this kind of a promissory relationship is inconsistent with there being any other basic goal. Well, I'm going to just go on in the narrower view. What's it getting to be? I don't have a watch on. Pardon? 7:50. Okay. 7:50? 7:30. Oh, okay. Well, we have time, but we'll. At any rate, defenders of the narrow view think there's an analogy between this supposed promissory relationship that management has to maximize profit for stockholders and a relationship that a private investor would have with an investment counselor, right? In other words, you go as a private investor, say you've got $10,000 to invest, you go to an investment counselor, and if you entrust money to them, it's for the specific purpose of making you money, right? So it's like turning over $10,000 and saying, make me as much money as you can with it, Mr. or Ms. Investment Counselor. That's how it views the relationship between management stockholders. And so, I mean, suppose you gave this investment advisor $10,000, and you talked to them, you know, a month later, and they said, hey, remember the Susan B. Coleman Walk for the Cure we had a week ago in town? Well, I know you agree with me that you know, curtailing breast cancer is a very worthy cause. So I'll tell you what I did. I took $2,000 of that $10,000 you gave me, and I gave it. I sponsored somebody in that walk, and I gave it to the community to lessen, you know, for research, breast cancer research. Well, the point is, you as a private investor would think that you had been. I mean, I can open this up, but wouldn't you think that if somebody did that no matter how good a cause promoting a walk for breast cancer is, you would think that you had been dealt with in an immoral manner because you gave them that money specifically to invest in your behalf and to make more money for you, not to give away to a good cause, even if it is a good cause, right? So, in other words, if you can understand this analogy, you can understand why defenders of the narrow view say, hey, look, if you as management have a moral obligation to maximize the profits of the stockholders, of the owners, it would be immoral if you, for instance, decided to take $50,000 or $1 million of corporate money and invest it in a new playground or a new park in the community. Or again, I mean, when I managed a store for a couple of years, we had a bed that was pink, and it was sponsored by Susan B. Coleman. Vera Wang, the designer, designed the mattress for us, and a portion of the profits went to Susan B. Coleman. But now two brothers own that company, and if they decided that that's a way they wanted to spend corporate funds, they as the owners, can do that. But what if you're a public corporation, you know, and you're not one of the owners, and the understanding under the narrow view is that you're hired to promote and maximize profit for the owners. Suppose you decide, well, we're going to give company money to a cause like breast cancer research. I mean, you know, the argument is that thinking you should broaden your corporate footprint, your corporate moral responsibility this way, is just like the private investment manager who took part of your $10,000 and gave it away. And so this is the argument. So Friedman then views executives of a corporation solely as agents serving shareholder interests, and you know, if they don't do this, then they're like an immoral investment counselor, argues Friedman. Now, the way to attack, in other words, an argument from analogy basically says, well, A and B are alike in respects X, Y, and Z. So, because they're alike in those respects, we have some good reason to think that they're alike in some further respect, W. That's the structure of an argument from analogy. You say there are parallels, and here, of course, the analogy is between the case of a private investor going to an investment advisor, and the argument is there are parallels between that relationship and the relationship of the managers of a corporation with stockholders. But the way to challenge an argument from analogy like that is to say, well, wait a second, there may be similarities, but there are disanalogous features. In other words, the analogy breaks down. So others deny that this is a relevant analogy. They say, well, the purchase of stock is not couched in these kinds of promissory terms. In other words, if I purchase XYZ company's stock, I don't get, along with that, some sort of an explicit promise from management that they're going to maximize my profits as a shareholder. Instead, others argue that stock purchasers buy from other shareholders, and so they're not directly putting their money into a corporation in quite the same way that that you would be putting your money as a private investor into the company of the investment advisor. And others hold that there are other factors that weaken this analogy. Most shareholders don't even know who management is, right? Unlike you, if you go to an investment advisor, Most shareholders have no direct contact with management. So the point is, if there is such a promise made by management to maximize shareholder profits, it's hard to pinpoint just who supposedly made this promise in a company. Now, what do you think about that observation? I mean, is it a good criticism of this view? To say, well, find the manager that's supposedly responsible for making this promise to only, maximize shareholder profits as management's sole responsibility. Well, at any rate, the argument is that it would be very hard to find someone who specifically has made any promise like this, and management can't pass on the offer to maximize profit. Well, and another observation that could be made is you could say, well, must a promise always be kept? We looked at, when we were looking at general ethical theories, we saw that moral philosophers differ in how strict they want to take our obligation to keep a promise. Yeah, I do make a moral obligation. I make myself under a moral obligation to you by promising something to you, even if it's just meeting you tomorrow for lunch. But do we always have to keep a promise? Well, again, we saw that one of the reasons why Immanuel Kant's system comes under criticism, the way it was originally stated, is he takes moral obligations like the obligation you bring upon yourself by making a promise to be a sort of absolute thing, allowing really no exceptions. If you made a promise, you ought to keep it. No ifs, ands, or buts, right? the categorical imperative comes in there. But in other words, first people say, well, the analogy is not a really good one. Maybe it breaks down. Maybe there really isn't any such a promise. But they say, well, even if there is, even if we assume that there is this promise on the part of management to maximize shareholder profit, in ordinary situations, and we looked at this before. I mean, suppose I have training as an emergency medical technician, and I promise to meet you for lunch tomorrow, but I pass an accident. You know, shouldn't I take it as a greater responsibility to try to save the life of this accident victim, even if it entails breaking my promise to you to meet you on time for lunch? And so if we can do this in ordinary, very simple situations, they would say, well, even if there is a promise between management and shareholders, in other words, an understood promise that management is employed basically to maximize shareholder profits, is that promise really intended to be a rigid mandate to maximize shareholder profit at all social costs? You know, and you can say, well, should profit be pursued at the cost of things like an unhealthy environment or unsafe products? You know, and I mean, most people, well, I don't know. What do you think? I grew up in Hamden, very close to Jones's Falls, and there were a lot of textile mills in Jones's Falls. And one of the things you learned as a kid growing up is you don't go wading in Jones's Falls. In other words, that you know, we thought there were so many chemicals and things from factories upstream going into Jones's Falls that even as a kid you were taught that you don't try to, you know, wade or do it, and certainly not swim in any area of Jones's Falls, you know. And so you know, should profit be maximized at all costs? Well, if a promise like that were thought to be immoral, then many would argue, should such a promise bind management, you know, or should management see it as part of its moral obligation to think of itself as having, yes, responsibilities to shareholders, but also as having moral responsibilities to other stakeholders? Well, a few more points, because I want to finish up the narrow view part in this slide. Are executives really agents of shareholders? Well, again, Friedman says shareholders select them to be exactly that, but in actual practice this doesn't happen. Corporate control really is usually in the hands of management, and it may hand-pick a board of directors that rubber stamps management's decisions in ways that go against the interests of shareholders. So it's entirely, you know, I mean, some management I mean, we saw this. This was part of what was so controversial when some of these companies were having serious problems before the big financial meltdown. You had companies that were losing tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet, in spite of the fact that they were not profitable, that the company was losing significant money, management took it upon themselves to pay themselves huge bonuses. You know, and how does that look out for shareholder interests? Well, you know, I mean, many would say that it doesn't, and so, you know, so quite simply, I mean, management doesn't always see it as its responsibility to pursue shareholder interests. And in 2000, Enron directors did something like this. They paid $750 million in executive compensation, while the entire net income of the company was just $950 million. So, in other words, that does not leave a lot left over for shareholder profits, for owner profits. So, you know, so there are problems, you know, and companies can actually ignore shareholder interests. So, in actual practice, shareholders don't really always pick executives, and executives can even act egoistically, ignoring shareholder interests. So, and again, even if the executives are selected by the shareholders to maximize profit, aren't there shareholders who would say, well, we don't mean that the company is to totally trash the lake it's located on, you know, just so I, as an investor, can make a little more profit. In other words, there are going to be shareholders who would be on board with maximizing profit, yes, but not maximizing profit at all social costs, and who might say, well look, I have an interest in XYZ company, I'm part owner, but I would like to see XYZ company, you know, act in an ethical way toward its surrounding community and toward the lake its factory happens to be located on, just to take an example. So the idea is there are reasons to look into broadening our view of corporate moral responsibility. Well, next time, I mean, you can look at the remainder of this. Now, I know this is an extremely long slide presentation. You know, I have not gotten you a printout of this. Is that correct? Yeah, I didn't think I had. Did I get you one of Chapter 4? Yeah. Okay. I got to make sure I do that and leave and have the. Thursday, I'm going to take it to the print shop, because a big job like this I like to take downstairs because they have better equipment to do it on. Yeah. All of these are viewable on Blackboard. Is that correct? I mean,
The one for tonight.
the one for tonight should be. It's called Corporate Responsibility. I think I double-checked it this afternoon. I'll look at it before I leave here to make sure it's viewable. And I always go in both. Now I'm recording this in the management number, but I'll copy it into the philosophy 265 when, So if you want to review anything, we'll have that. Okay, one of the first things we're going to do next time is look at that little, it's about 15 to 20 minutes long, little blurb from PBS on two different views of corporate moral responsibility. And I think it's good for you to see two real executives out there in the real world taking opposing positions on this, to know that this isn't just a theoretical academic distinction that only, ivory tower academics are worried about. The narrow versus a broad view of corporate moral responsibility, but that real executives in the real world do have differing points of view on this, and that's pointed out very well in this little NewsHour discussion. So, okay, well, I'm sure people are pretty worn out from the test. I said the first thing we will do is not look at the PBS video. The first thing, God willing, we will do, God willing and the creeks don't rise, is we will go over the task. Because obviously you want to know what you got on it, and I give them, should have everything graded and ready for us to do that. Okay, take care. Would someone turn on the lights on their way out? And okay, thank you very much. And have